That's important for understanding of Said. One of the reasons he was a pivotal figure for me in thinking through these questions is in so much of his work, he does come back to that question of what does it mean to be a Palestinian, writing as a Palestinian within these broader systems and institutions that very much capitulate to the Zionist narrative for the same reasons that they uphold broader projects of imperialism and colonialism. It's not just a matter of getting an opportunity to speak or to write a book or an article. It's also a question of doing that within this broader project of meaning that is intended to disallow the Palestinian narrative from having any space of its own. If it does get that space in spite of the odds, then to silencing that completely. Social media was one of the main Achilles heels of the Israeli project. People were just seeing all of this footage and posts and things coming out of Gaza. It was harrowing and it stoked people's indignation. I think obviously there's an awareness that their PR is failing and that social media helped make that possible. I don't know if you were going to have a question about this, but this also explains why you can have companies like Meta or platforms like Twitch thinking that they need to make policies policing criticism of the term
There's definitely
Zionism,
a question
right?
about that, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's part of what explains it. Really, it is up to the discretion of the moderators who have a particular political and worldview
You're going
that
to
they're
make me go off
normalizing.
script here. I do not find it surprising that people might use Zionist as a proxy to Jew. I haven't personally come across it, but I'm sure it happens. How prevalent is it that you need to update your hateful conduct policy? I have no idea.
That's the other point, because when you do something, it is also a signal that there is a prevalence that necessitates some kind of intervention.
Are you arguing there isn't then? In chapter 10, what it's kind of, it hit my heart, to be honest with you. Yeah, my YouTube channel was very small, right? It only kind of picked up when I reached out to Professor Norman Finkelstein and he kind of gave me an opportunity and so on. And whatever this small thing is, relatively speaking, it's been built since then. And the kind of disgusting thing about it is it's built in tandem, I guess, with the genocide in Gaza. It's almost like I could be benefiting from it in a sense. You've had this beautiful book over here, Omar. Have you had a similar thought at all? You have a book coming out
Absolutely.
that you won't have sold as many as you are hopefully going to sell if it wasn't for the current situation. It sounds disgusting, man, but it's kind of true, and I'm not sure the best way to rationalize that or internalize it or understand it, you know?
I think if we are good people,
Correct me if I'm wrong, it's 9 a.m. On a Sunday morning for you,
that's
right,
right.
in LA.
That's
So I
correct.
apologize for that, firstly.
No worries, happy to be here.
It's become a bit of a unknown tradition on my channel here. I tend not to actively introduce the guests. I like to ask them to introduce themselves. You know, I don't want to tell people who you are. I want to give you the opportunity to. So, you know, who is Omar Zahzah? Through the eyes, mind, and heart of Omar Zahzah. Go
Wow.
as deep and shallow as you want with that. Moin gave me a very one-liner, which he wasn't interested in. But you can take as long as you want, or short as you
Yeah,
want.
I like that question. It's funny because I mean, I find the whole format of giving a biography or stating it very strange too, because obviously there's much more to you than what the rest of the world sees. You know, it doesn't always line up with who you feel you actually are, even as you've done, you know, particular individual things that people may be interested in. And, you know, it's kind of funny. There's the Palestinian poet and journalist Hamad al-Kurd has this poem, I think, called Anti-Biography, that basically is about that, like having to be in front of people who only know you for specific things you've done, and understanding that there's a bit of an artificiality to that process, but that still constitutes the meaning that so many people over, you know, kind of like determine you by. So it's a really interesting question. That said, I'm still going to go to the pretty much the stock answer. I'll say I'm a writer and independent journalist and poet, and I'm also an assistant professor in Arab Muslim ethnicities and diaspora studies at San Francisco State University. And I do think that, you know, getting to that question of how you think of yourself, like I have always thought of myself as a writer first and foremost, and I think that does inform a lot of what I do. And certainly a lot of the book, you know, Terms of Servitude, that came out of that trajectory, basically, because a lot of it evolved from independent journalism that I was doing, you know, at particular moments in time.
Okay, awesome, yeah. So you mentioned your book there, and I have prepared a copy over here.
Yeah, I see it sitting very nicely in front of the kafia.
Prior to this discussion then, just a brief background for the viewers. I was given a copy of your book and asked if I'd be interested in speaking to you about it, hence we're here. I was unsure, you know, how to best put my questions together. Do I go for a chapter by chapter format? I spoke to Omar beforehand just for his opinion on that. What you said roughly was, no matter how thorough the interview is, it can never fully recreate the book. So I sort of start this interview by saying, we can't go through every chapter, unfortunately. I do have way more questions than we have the time to cover. But if you find the topics interesting, if you find the conversation interesting, the quotes, the references, then definitely purchase yourself a copy of Omar's book. And there's no sponsorship here, just in case people think I'm being forced. Okay, so Omar, so in the introduction chapter of your book, I wanted to just share a few quotes
Yeah.
because I feel like it gives. Okay, I don't want to act like I'm on the fence with these things. It's a very serious and sensitive topic, but these few quotes here, hopefully, certainly for myself and hopefully for the listeners, I feel like it gave me an understanding of the way you see this, conflict, to use, say, let's say, a neutral term. Okay, so and please, Omar, do butt in as you wish,
Yeah.
right? I'll just throw a few quotes up. So you start with quote: "The story of Palestine is a series of failed silencings. You highlight a number of key events that build up to the current day, starting with the Nakba of 1948, which resulted in the forced expulsion of over 750,000 Palestinians and killing of approximately 15,000. The 1967 Naksa, or setback in Arabic, quote, under which the Zionist state colonized the remaining 22% of Palestine, that being the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, in addition to the Syrian Golan Heights. Quote, Israel established a brutal modern regime of military occupation of these territories. You mentioned the 1982 Sabra and Shatila massacre, in which approximately 2 to 3,000 civilians, mostly Palestinians and Lebanese Shia, were killed. Jumping ahead a bit closer to modern time, there was 2008's Operation Khaled, which was, quote, a massive Israeli bombardment campaign of the Gaza Strip, of which the majority population consists of Palestinians expelled from their homes in 1948. Regarding Khaled specifically, you write, quote, Khaled initiated a style of Zionist collective assault that will be replicated in 2012's Pillar of Defense, 2014's Operation Protective Edge, in 2021 and in 2022, and of course during Israel's current ongoing genocide of Palestinians in Gaza that began in October 2023. What are all of these examples of settler colonial murder, assault, and land theft, if not the ultimate enactments of silencing, of erasure? You also share a number of quotes from Edward Said. You mentioned that he was a key sort of guiding figure in
Yeah.
in your understanding. Can you expand on that just a little bit?
Yeah. On all of that, or on the Said and then coming back to.
Specifically the Said, and then I just have a few quotes
Sure,
before we
sure.
get into questions. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to expand on that. And then I'll come back very briefly to something that you said about the conflict, or to use a more neutral term.
Mm,
Part of what I was trying to do in the book, and I mean, of course, I'm not the only person to do this, but part of what I think we're coming up against whenever we try to write about Palestine, and I mean by we, I mean kind of denoting sort of a loose collective of anybody who is interested in writing about Palestine with the broader project of challenging and reversing the oppression that Palestinians face,
yeah.
and that they face as a result of what many of us, of a settler colonial project, essentially. So I don't say all that to be pedantic. I say that actually because part of the work that we do when we write articles or when we write books is we know we're working against this broader machinery of propaganda that makes people think that what's happening is not a colonial process, or is not a result of direct imbalances, excuse me, of power that are inflicted upon an indigenous people, but the other kind of propagandistic talking points that we may hear, the centuries old struggle, religious, animosity, so on and
Hmm.
so forth. So part of it is that although I do think it's important to certainly, as a journalist and as a writer, to have accurate information, I'm not
Yeah.
necessarily looking to play to the conception of balance, that is often used to silence these types of analyses. So yeah, I just wanted to say that as a way of like clarifying my own methodology.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah. For
think
sure.
that's important for Said too, for understanding of Said as well. I think because one of the reasons that he was a pivotal figure for me in thinking through these questions is, in so much of his work, he does come back to that question of what does it mean to be a Palestinian, writing as a Palestinian within these broader systems and institutions that you know very much capitulate to the Zionist narrative for the same reasons that they uphold broader projects of imperialism and colonialism, right? So it's not just a matter of getting an opportunity to speak or to write a book, or an article. It's also a question of doing that within this broader project of meaning that is intended to disallow the Palestinian narrative from having any space of its own. And once it does, if it does get that space in spite of the odds, then to silencing that completely, right? So I think that that broader project is one of the main reasons that Said was such an influence. And then, of course, there are the ways that he reads the concept of hegemony, which is basically how patterns or styles of thought that are the most beneficial for systems of power to have other people think, how they kind of tend to recreate themselves within the cultural realm without direct coercion. That concept of hegemony was how Said explained the prevalence of what he referred to as Orientalism. So these patterns of, excuse me, discourse that demonize and other, people of the East, of the Arab and Muslim world. So, conceptually, there's a lot of reasons that I felt that Said was such an influence on this project. Hearing you ask the question now, I suppose really one of the main reasons, beyond the specific relevance of particular essays, including Permission to Narrate, which I find so influential, I think it's that broader project that Said had precisely of giving voice to the experience and the perspective of being a Palestinian within contexts where the Palestinian narrative continues to be challenged, in the political sphere and on the cultural sphere, and archiving that challenge, right, that he was facing in real time as he was nevertheless giving voice to the things that, the powers that be would have silenced. I think that's one of the main reasons that I found his work to be so influential.
Yeah, so I just wanted to share a quote that you mentioned in your book as well. You say Said indicted the media for culturally fortifying Zionism through exclusion and misrepresentation. Quote, if the Arab occupies any space in the mind at all, it is of negative value. He wrote in his 1970 essay, The Arab Portrayed. He is seen as the disruptor of Israel's continuing existence, or in a larger view, a surmountable obstacle to Israel's creation in 1948. So there are a few quotes here. I just thought, I've not, okay, I'm going off the cuff here, but I've not heard much about him, and I found some of these quotes just to be very, what's the term? I'm not an academic, so I don't know, capturing it kind of I don't know, almost gave me a good. It's something that you already know, but it kind of captures it in
Yeah,
a sentence. Do you know
yeah,
what I mean?
yeah, yeah,
It's like he's got it in a sentence there.
yeah,
It kind of resonates with my feeling of what I've seen and heard. Do you know what I
yeah,
mean?
yeah. No, definitely. It does have that effect of something you've experienced or something you've even thought, and then you see somebody has written it down, and in these ways
Mm.
that just, you know, give it so much meaning. Like, oh wow, okay, I've thought this to myself many times. I never thought anybody else had already written it down or had thought about it in this way. Um, and I think that's one of the things that's so striking about going back to some of those pieces. I mean, if you look at, for example, to go back to that essay, well, the Arab Portrait, the one you read, is from 1970, and already he's saying so much of what he's going to continue to say in other works that become more known, but also in a sense, it
Mm.
already sort of puts everything out there, you know? And so that's one of the fascinating things I felt about going back to his work is seeing how much of the project that he was going to undertake, with things like Orientalism or other later essays was already there, even in some of his earliest works. But that's the other thing that I think it's both important and both kind of depressing but inspiring, because if you go
Mm.
to another essay, Permission to Narrate, which I believe is 1984, you read some of those lines the way that the Western media in Israel talk about the Palestinian Liberation Organization at the time, right? Things like they're cockroaches in a bottle, they're terrorists, they're anti-Semites, and you could swap out PLO with Hamas today, and you would see exactly both the same rhetoric, but you would also see the same kind of discursive strategy of just completely demonize an entire people based on an organization, and misrepresents the goals of the broader political project to such a degree that what you're doing essentially is using the media to fearmonger, and fearmongering to justify collective punishments, right? So it's just seeing so many of those dynamics, I think, rendered so clearly and powerfully, and yet it's been decades and decades later, and we're still experiencing the same thing. So I find it clarifying because it's good to see to have figures, like Said, who had already done the work of sort of naming this for what it is so long ago, but we're also still very much in the thick of these processes that they have called out, right? And so it's kind of grappling with that issue now.
The final quote I'll share here then is in the essay that you mentioned, the 1948 Permission to Narrate quote, facts do not at all speak for themselves, but require a socially acceptable narrative to absorb, sustain, and circulate them. So long as Palestinians continue to be denied, quote, permission to narrate, as Said's essay is titled, the details of settler colonialism, violence, and siege will continue to be obscured as part of a broader mainstream cultural erasure. I thought that was, as I say, I haven't read anything of him, to be honest. So I'm going to have to do some research, basically.
Well,
I think,
hopefully, I give you a good sampling at least.
yeah, I think it's brilliant, actually.
But
Actually, I had so many quotes I wanted to share, and I thought, you know what, in the interest of time, I can't. There were another one from Chomsky and so on.
yeah.
Maybe in a part two, we'll see, or people can buy the book and have a read.
Yeah, see how your listeners like this interview. We can decide if they want more quotes or not. But I'm glad you said that because in the writing process too, there was. I mean, I always actually tend to try to give as many quotes as possible sometimes, and so I do. There was a part of me that said, "I'm wondering if this is too much or if it's working," but we managed to hew it down together with the copy editors, and I
Mhm.
mean, people are still saying that it resonates, which is good. But yeah, I tend to like to give as much of the context, or sometimes as many of like the quotes sequentially as possible to really build up a point. So I was
Mhm.
conscious of this fact. It's like, okay, are these a little bit too many quotes? But I feel like I'm following a through line, so hopefully it's okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Let's just hash out that last quote because I think it's also
Mm.
fundamental. Um, you know, one thing I've noticed from rereading Said, and also it just so happens that I'm teaching a class on him now, like in the middle of doing all this, book promotion type stuff. So it's all fresh on my mind and relevant. Is in a few of his pieces, he'll come back to this question of what exactly is a fact, right? Because oftentimes, in terms of common sense, we could sort of more or less take it for granted that a fact is something that has a very direct definition. It's immediately identifiable, um, and we know what it is. But part of the arguments that he makes is that sometimes even the definition of what constitutes fact is something that is sort of gets to be determined by the powers that be, right, or by the shapers of hegemonic common sense. And also, whatever we decide a fact is, it doesn't really mean anything unless you have um, the perspective of all individuals within a given political situation, and have the ability for them to be humanized and to speak to their stories and represent them accurately and fully, which is, obviously not the case for Palestinians, as part of the argument he's making in the essay, because they've been denied permission to narrate. Then it doesn't matter how many pieces of information you have about um, settlement expansion or about the different configurations of the Palestinian landmass, all the way from 1948, say, up to the present. All those things don't matter because you don't have the humanization of an entire group of people. And so, whatever we consider to be facts are always going to be things that hew to the dominant narrative of power, right? And that justify or just continue to elide their oppression completely. So we need narratives in order for facts to make sense, essentially. And if we, have people continue to have their narratives denied, then you don't have information, you don't have news. What you have is propaganda in the service of power.
Right. The facts that are denied are almost like an abstract comment statement that have I understood that correctly?
Yeah. It's the whatever could be facts that are denied through the narratives also being denied is one thing,
Mm.
but then there's also through because the narrative itself is denied, then whatever information people say is relevant, about the political struggle, is always just going to be information that continues to support the dominant power, right, or the colonial power, let's say. If Palestinians are denied their narratives, then the only so-called facts that people are interested in, or the things that get to be considered facts, are always going to be the things that reinforce the support for the Israeli project, essentially. And that
Right.
is made possible by the denial of Palestinian narratives. But when you have the Palestinian narratives acknowledged and accepted, then in turn you also have an important reconstitution of what it is for something to be relevant information. Because, again, we can come back to this question of the particular paradigm that somebody adheres to when it comes to Palestine, right? If you accept that it's a settler colonial struggle, the types of information that you think are relevant to that are going to be very different from somebody who essentially is, recirculating propaganda about how no, this is a centuries-old struggle, right? The things that they think are relevant facts are going to be very different, right? But so the more that you humanize people, the more that you start to have facts that actually relate concretely to their immediate condition, if that makes sense.
Right. I follow, yeah. Okay, hopefully that was a good introduction, I guess. Just for the viewers and yourself, I guess. I'll be jumping between chapters here a bit, but I've tried to tie in the questions together. So if you can tell us briefly, if I can ask you to, Omar, here, about the use of blacklist sites that you write about. Are they Israeli run necessarily? I'm not sure, but specifically I'm asking here about Canary Mission. People might have heard of them. And stopantisemitism.org. How are they operated? What are they used for? Who runs them? Have you had any personal experience with them? If so, was it a pleasant experience or not?
Yeah, thank you, thank you. Yeah, blacklist sites. So in one chapter of the book, I open up with my own experience of having been added to the digital blacklist site Canary Mission, which I think your viewers are probably familiar with this site in particular. A lot of people have
Possibly.
started to know the site. I think it's gotten kind of a broader um, knowledge about its existence at this point. But more or less, as I recall, in 2015 is when it really activated, and the whole point, or at least when it sort of really came to be prominent within the movement, and people were, like myself, were aware that we'd been added to it. And the I'll talk about that site a little bit, and then I'll go into the broader dynamics of
Sure.
blacklisting and doxing sites.
Yep.
But the purpose of that project, as I go into the book, and as your viewers, I'm sure, are aware, is that it's supposed to be an anonymously run site. Nobody knows who manages it, and it just continues to add newer and newer digital dossiers on organizers and activists who do Palestine work, as well as academics, faculty, and I think in general, it's also sometimes just broadly movement figures, or even sometimes staff, depending on if people have ever said anything in support of Palestine, essentially. And the site really purports to exist to make sure that the job prospects and livelihoods of anybody who does Palestine work are ruined, right? They had this tagline like "Make sure that today's radicals do not become tomorrow's employees." And the purpose of the site really is one, it's to intimidate because you see that you're added to this blacklist. It's also supposed to stoke and encourage doxing because it puts the employment information of people on there. It puts if you're in an institution, it puts your affiliation. And somebody could argue that some of this is publicly available information, but at the same time, they're clearly inciting people to call people's employers or to and so people have had, their jobs called, they've had harassment, they've had threats that they faced as a result of, this information put up in such an attempt as to clearly coordinate doxing attempts. Um, Now, Canary Mission is kind of the prototype and it's been around for a while. You've had newer sites that follow in its wake, like stopantisemitism.org, and like some other smaller ones, honestly. And I think part of what happens is that because the very nature of how something like Canary Mission is supposed to work is also not necessarily just that it's supposed to be the definitive or the end all be all site, but rather that it provides this copy, of these misrepresentations of individuals and you know these accusations of them being terrorists, so on and so forth. It provides this as copy that could then be taken and applied into another context, right? Put onto another site or put into a letter making threats against somebody or complaining to an employer. And so I think it's not that surprising that you've started to see more and more sites of this nature emerge because kind of by their design they are supposed to be um, things that inspire other forms of coordinated uh, digital facilitation of harassment, let's say. So, we've heard of things like people having complaint letters read against them that are citing from Canary Mission. I've heard of things where, again, people are getting calls from their employer that are quoting the site. And at one point, I looked at, a professor who was facing a harassment campaign, and it seemed like some of the people working on that campaign were also pulling from Canary Mission in order to kind of justify their complaints to, the university about him. So it's, on the one hand, there's the site, but then there's also the language of the site that is very much intended to be recycled and recirculated in all sorts of ways, and to help, the followers or the base do all
It's
these
almost providing
harassments.
a resource for
Exactly.
the public. It's
Exactly.
like
Exactly.
it's an arrow. It's like an
Yes.
arrow.
Yeah. It's an
You know
arrow.
what to
Take
do.
it and put it in the bow. Yeah.
So what have they done to you? Just out
Yeah.
of curiosity.
Well,
What's your experience been?
I was added to the site, but to be honest, and I was added pretty early on. I was still in graduate school at the time. I was in Students for Justice in Palestine at UCLA. And that to me was one of the things that actually kind of tipped me off that this wasn't necessarily run by people that we know or people that we're close to, because what they seemed to be doing from the outset was they were just going off of what they knew about who was leadership on what campus, and sort of just starting to populate the site that way, or naming very famous professors. It sort of felt clear that, and of course, one of the other chilling things that they do is they list like your close associations. So it's supposed to be people that you're close with or that you're familiar with. And, not to give any more ammunition, but I remember when that happened, I looked at that and I was like, I know these people, but I wouldn't say most of these are actually my close associates. So it's like, it's some kind of, it gave you the sense that it's somebody from afar kind of keeping tabs, but they don't totally know the full details, but they're making all these accusations and, clearly
Just seeing
trying
what
to,
sticks, maybe.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So it was strange, but yeah. So they put up my information. They put up, my campus affiliation, and the same sort of thing. They're trying to stoke harassment. Now, actually, one of the things that's happening is that I see some of these accounts that they're just clearly bot accounts on X. The site, actual site formerly known as Twitter. I don't know how long we're gonna have to keep saying that for, but
Well, I've noticed you tend to call it the site formerly known as Twitter. You
yeah,
don't like to call it X.
yeah.
You're not a fan of Elon, I think.
No, yeah, I don't know what would give you that idea, especially from reading what I wrote. But I see some of these bot accounts, and they actually also just recirculate the Canary Mission page. So I recently had a bot account on X, trying to making these posts, essentially just recirculating the Canary Mission language, word for word, and just trying to alert people to the fact there's this professor at San Francisco State, and this using the Canary. Like, this is from 2015. This is old.
Can I pause you on that 1 second, Omar? Just because I want to get to that point, but I want to quickly ask a question before that. Just specifically on these blacklist sites before we go into bots and so on, right? And I apologize for interrupting that.
Yeah, yeah.
You mentioned, and it was in chapter 2 of your book, that there have been reports that these blacklist sites have been used by Israeli border agents to prevent Palestinians from visiting their families. I have no specific question about that in and of itself. It seems entirely reasonable, and it wouldn't be surprising, basically, right?
Yeah.
But I'm curious, just because myself, as an example, so I visited Palestine in February 2023, so just less than a year before the October situation, with a group of around 40 or 50 people, and the whole
Hmm.
group, and this is a common experience, but I'll just give our example.
Yeah.
People might not be aware, so I don't know if it's specific to Muslims or not, or what the line is here, but we were clearly a group of Muslims coming from the UK. Our whole group was sort of directed to a waiting area by the Israeli border agents, and then one by one they asked us to come for a bit of a I don't know, interview, question, whatever, in a separate room. So the entire group was held for about 4 or 5 hours or something. There was 40 or 50 of us. I would say 95% of us were allowed entry, and the remaining few people, they were held in total for like 8 hours or something.
Wow.
I don't know what additional questions they were asked or whatnot, but the questions I was asked, for example, it just seemed so random. It was like, have you visited Africa? Have you, what you're here for? Just total random stuff. So put all that out there to say, what do you think they were doing in that time period? Were they possibly checking all of us, cross-referencing these kind of sites or our social media, or is that your
Yeah,
thing?
yeah,
Is that
absolutely,
a
yeah.
similar thing?
No, that's a very similar thing. I think that's part of the process, and I'm glad you flagged that because it gets to the other point of utility of them in addition to the harassment, and to the coordinating the doxing and intimidating people from not doing organizing. I think part of it is that they are at times used. So the reporting that I was citing, I believe it was the Guardian. I'll have to double check the note, but I think it was the Guardian that was one of the first sources that reported on the fact that people were having their Canary Mission profiles used to screen them, when they were trying to go visit Palestine, essentially. And I also, I think there was an account by an activist who wrote a piece in the Electronic Intifada mentioning that part of her interrogation had been either information directly from Canary Mission or at least very clearly tied to her campus organizing. So when we talk about this copy, this replicable copy that's ever available to be used, I do think part of it is to provide more quote unquote intel, for these border agents essentially to be able to dig things up. We know that, for example, this is why sometimes people are very cautious, obviously, about going in with phones or computers or things because or cautious about their online presence, precisely
Mm.
because the and if you look at being on Canary Mission, for example, part of what it does is it really alters your search quota in the sense of like your profile is pretty much always going to be one of the things that comes up, right? If you're on that site. So yeah, I definitely do think that part of the purpose is to be able to use it. There have been reports of it being used. Now, of course, the exact metrics of how an interrogation and a search goes, we don't have total access to because they keep it so opaque. But we have experiences like your experience. You know what you went through. We have accounts from people and what they've gone through. Those who have chosen to talk about it or write about it. And so, based on all those things, we do know that yes, these sites are definitely being used, and that is part of the function.
So it extends beyond. Obviously, it's much more serious that they're using such sites to prevent Palestinians from meeting their families in Palestine. But it does seem to expand beyond that,
Hmm.
beyond just
Yeah,
Palestinians.
absolutely. And I mean, I mentioned
Maybe
the
anyone.
Palestinians. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I mentioned the Palestinian context just because I was like, well, this is another way that this is like, politically egregious because this is also
Mm.
facilitating denial of the right of return, right, on some level. But yeah, definitely the net is wider,
Yeah.
for sure.
Just wanted to get your opinion on that. Yeah. You've spoken about, or wrote about, should I say. For the year of 2025, Israel increased its Hasbara budget by an additional $150 million. What exactly is this Hasbara budget? Where is the 150 million coming from?
Mhm.
And how is it split and allocated and so on? And I want to throw in a few more points if I can,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
recently we've heard about this $7,000 per post. I'll give a few examples from your book as well. So Betar USA, which is
Mhm.
like a very kind of how would you categorize them, like an extreme Zionist kind of
Yeah. I might
like
even go so
hardcore
far as to say
basically,
they're like a fascist hate group. Like that's how I would put
Yeah.
it.
But just as an example, they were offering $1,800 to
Mhm.
anyone who would put a pager in a particular pro-Palestinian individual sort of pocket, which was
Yeah.
alluding to the pager attack on Hezbollah or Lebanon. How do all of these different points tied together, the $7,000, the 1,800 with Bitar, are these all coming from that additional 150 million? Where is that 150 coming from? Because we have kind of maybe two sides of the same coin in some respects with Israel and America and how they are funding propaganda.
Mhm. Yeah. I mean, the simplest answer is this is coming from the Israeli government ultimately. I mean, the 150 million is the government basically investing more in its digital propaganda because they're aware, particularly after or during the genocide, I should say, that, even as it became much more censorious, which is what my book is about, at the same time, social media was one of the main Achilles heels really of the Israeli project because people were just seeing all of this footage and posts and things coming out of Gaza, and it really just it was harrowing and it really just stoked people's indignation, right? So I think um, obviously there's an awareness that their PR is failing and that social media helped make that possible. And of course, I should say too that, you know, um, particularly in the 2010s, you did see a big kind of a commitment, on the Israeli state's part to consciously engaging more in digital Hasbara or propaganda, right? So the attempt to use the internet for the purposes of rehabilitating Israel's image is not necessarily a very new thing. I mean, it's not it's certainly not something that started within the last year or 2 years. But the difference is that now it's following in the wake of this kind of, PR disaster that Israel is facing. And so, this is essentially money that the Israeli government is putting into increasing its propaganda operations, right? And this can look in various ways. I mean, this could be recruiting influencers to do more posts about Israel. This could be continuing programs like the Hasbara Fellowship programs that train people to advocate for Israel on their campuses. It's probably going to be some combination of that. And of course, we've seen Netanyahu talk very directly about this, how we need more influencers to take up the cause for Israel, right? That's been in the news a lot lately. So, and then of course, when you get into different organizations like Betar, but not even just like Betar, we could talk about like Stand With Us or so. All of these organizations are ultimately affiliated with groups that are in turn affiliated with the Israeli government, right? And so this does all come back to the Israeli government one way or the other. Whether it's through intermediary organizations that are working closely, that are then funneling resources and information and framing.
Yeah.
So
Is the
that's.
financial trail coming from this 150 then, are you saying?
I wouldn't necessarily say that. I think the 150 is really for the Israeli state and perhaps for affiliate training programs, like the fellowships say. But
Right.
I do think that ultimately a lot of I would argue, I would speculate, let's say, I would give an educated speculation that other projects that we see that are really initiatives to, especially financially incentivize organize people to do certain things on behalf of the Israeli state or to participate in campaigns attacking and demonizing protesters that look suspiciously like other campaigns of that nature that we've seen. I would speculate that there is some kind of broader tie that ultimately does go back to the Israeli government, which is not the same as saying the
Okay.
government is literally giving the money. But I am saying that I think a lot of these organizations ultimately are part of a consortium with each other.
Right.
I
Okay.
have to stipulate that legally, so I don't. I don't.
Yeah, maybe send a copy of this to your lawyers before we put
Yeah,
it
yeah,
out,
yeah,
perhaps. Okay, so I just wanted to look at another example, an organization called Do Belong.
yeah,
You're right, in July 2022, Do Belong was openly targeting Palestinian accounts, occasionally giving cash prizes, which was a clear violation, you say, of Meta's community standards. Do Belong gamed the rules of the platform so as to maximize the impact of their financially compensated harassment while minimizing the possibility of accountability. Through their partisan prizes, the organization provided $360 payments to, quote, brave social media influencers working day and night to call out anti-Semitism and protect Israel's right to defend itself. As of July 2022, Do Belong claimed to have awarded 23 young individuals with cash prizes for digital pro-Israel advocacy. Can you tell us a bit about Do Belong? Is this more of an American organization or an Israeli organization? I'm trying to understand, I guess, here. I'm failing to articulate the question well, but where exactly is this money coming from? I mean, $360 in these cash prizes multiplied by 23 is maybe like $8,000. That is almost nothing.
yeah.
But maybe it's a small example of a wider net or something.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think the like if you the amount certainly could have been larger, but so this, Jubilong is a registered nonprofit organization. It presents itself as an organization dedicated to the primary goal of just making sure that Jewish people feel like they belong, as far as I understand it, even if they don't conventionally fit the mold of what, you know, a stereotypical idea of what Jewish belonging means. Like they're supposed to feel like they're still a part of a broader community, and they shouldn't shy away, right, from embracing that. So I mean, that's how it positions itself. It's supposed to be this cultural organization ultimately, but what you find when you scratch beneath the surface is it seems like the majority of its efforts are really about promoting Israel and Zionism. And I'm not sure if your listeners are familiar with this, but one of their most famous tactics is they usually will pay for billboards, and so you'll see these billboards that are hot pink, right? And they'll just say a slogan of theirs, but usually it's some kind of Zionist related messaging. Something like "so many protests for Palestine and none for Myanmar really makes you think," or like they had one at one point that said something like "let's be clear, Hamas would cut your head off too," and then they had to take that down because they got so many complaints about it. But so the point is that basically they present themselves in one way, and what they're doing is actually engaging in the promotion of Zionist propaganda through various means. I think the hot pink billboard is one of their most distinctive um, efforts, or most recognizable ones, certainly, especially for people who are local to the Bay Area like myself. But the other one was the partisan prizes, which I went into in that piece. Now, um, they are registered nonprofits, so I believe that means they go through the usual channels in terms of like different donors and in terms of different organizations that may want to dedicate to them for the reasons that an organization would ostensibly dedicate resources to a nonprofit. But what they did with this partisan prizes, which I just want to be clear, they're no longer there on the site as far as I see, but I wrote about them at the time that they were happening, so there's still documentation of them having existed. But basically, this was a series of prizes for different individuals, basically among them, prominent Zionist influencers and journalists. And what the prizes ended up being used for really was to stoke this ongoing harassment campaign against the co-creators of a podcast called the Palestine Pod. And so that's how I was basically tapped to write the story, because the two co-creators of that podcast were experiencing this intense harassment from individuals that they quickly found were linked to these partisan prizes. And these individuals were making posts saying things like, we got the Palestine Pod account taken down, we can do it again.
So they
Right?
were mass reporting, right? This is what you mentioned, the mass
Yes.
reporting. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's one of the things they were engaging in: mass reporting, sending harassing messages.
Incentivized
Yeah.
mass reporting. Yeah.
Yeah, and so it became pretty clear that the prizes, or the money from the prizes was being used to kind of financially incentivize this behavior, because these individuals, and I'm talking about the ones who were the recipients of the prizes, were basically presenting their efforts, as being kind of work, in the true spirit of what the prize was dedicated to. Part of what we did was we reached out to Meta to say, hey, we XYZ, this seems like this is a coordinated effort. These people are being financially compensated to harass your users. And this is where I mentioned the point about gaming. What Meta would respond with was, well, technically they're not doing anything wrong. We can't blame somebody for reporting, another account. If something else happens, feel free to reach out to us, or that's if they responded at all.
Did you specifically mention to Meta that this was incentivized
Yeah.
mass reporting, like
Yeah.
we're paying people to, and does that break their rules of conduct?
So harassment is supposed to break the rules of conduct, and the fact that it was incentivized certainly sort of suggested that this is an artificial campaign to really
Yeah.
game the mechanisms of the platform, right? This is no longer a complaint that's of just one person or even two people. This is something that is at a scale that is clearly just intended to sabotage. So we did convey those things, but Meta um, basically chose not to you know to act on this particular issue. And so, but what I want to be clear, when I mentioned the violation of their community standards, I was particularly talking about the harassment, because they say that there's no harassment on our platforms. We don't tolerate any harassment. So that's what we were all referring to when we said this seems to be in violation. This is an incentivized pattern of behavior that is also clearly supposed to stoke harassment, to make the platform inhospitable for people based on their beliefs, essentially, and based on their program, you know?
You mentioned in January of 2025, yeah, so you've called them a far-right Zionist group, Betar
Mhm.
USA, offering the 1,800 on X for someone to hand a beeper to the Palestinian activist Nadine Kiswani, chair of the New York-based organization Within Our Lifetime. So I mentioned that earlier. Hopefully this is not a silly question, but can the sort of pro-Palestinian accounts not mass report something like this? You wouldn't need to really incentivize people to pay anyone. I mean, if someone showed me that, I would report it. I mean, that's ridiculous. I don't know about the law in the US in terms of incitement. Firstly, you're paying someone, so I'm not exactly sure where that fits, but to hand someone a beeper,
Yeah.
which is obviously, as you mentioned earlier, is in reference to the explosives that were put in the beepers with Hezbollah and Lebanon and so on. Why didn't this get mass reported and taken down by others?
Well,
do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I know what you mean.
There are thousands of pro-Palestinian accounts that would find this. I mean, if I saw it, I would report it. You don't have to pay me
Absolutely.
to do that. So
Yeah.
how is it? How are they able to operate?
Absolutely. I mean, I don't know the specifics of that post in particular, why, but in general, there are a lot of mass reporting of posts, but the thing about mass reporting is it's up to the discretion of the moderators, right? And so, we certainly know that Beitar has been able to continue their usage of X relatively uncompromised. You know and so part of it is that you get into a question of some real double standards in terms of what is considered something warranting censorship or removal or even suspension versus what are the types of things that are normalized. So in this case, in terms of this post, I would imagine it was reported, and I would imagine it was even mass reported. I can't say for sure. I'm not sure what actually happened to it, but you're right. It's something that's so clear on its face that it certainly you would think people would see to take it down. But I do know that the activities of that account have been relatively uncompromised in general, which to me suggests that even if there is reporting, we come back to the issue of the enforcement of the reporting is up to the discretion of the moderator, which in this case, we're talking about Elon's X. We don't know how we will see how far that really goes. But that's the other issue, that I come up, I think, against more broadly in the book. The title is The Pawn in Terms of Servitude, because part of what I'm arguing is that basically these things are really up to the enforcement of these private actors who have really little to no pressure points in terms of accountability for people to be able to use. So, they get to decide what a community standard is and enforce it accordingly, which sounds relatively benign, but then we need to keep in mind, like even going back to that conversation earlier about whose narratives are, permitted to circulate culturally and whose are not, what gets to be a fact and what doesn't. All of this is really about the particular political and worldviews of certain actors with power to determine and shape the way the rest of us formulate our expressions and circulate them, within the digital cultural sphere. So that question of things also coming back to the discretion of the content moderator, um, I think really is an important one. And I think it really explains a lot of where we are now in terms of what gets taken down and what doesn't, who needs to deal with having their online presence constantly throttled and who doesn't, right? It's really going to be people who are doing Palestine work on various levels.
Okay, so it's not simply a numbers game, basically. It's not simply a case of, okay, well, most of the world at the moment probably stands with Palestine, given what they've borne witness to over the last 2 years. Having more accounts and more numbers, it's not necessarily as simple as that. It comes down to the discretion of those who implement.
Exactly. And that also explains, I don't know if you were going to have a question about this, but this also explains, for example, why you can have companies like Meta or, platforms like Twitch thinking that they need to make policies policing criticism of the
There's
term
definitely a
Zionism,
question
right?
about that, yeah.
Yeah. That's part of what explains it, though, is like really it is up to the discretion of the moderators who have a particular political and
Oh, you're
worldview
gonna
that they're
make me go off
normalizing.
script here, Omar. You're gonna make me go. I'm gonna have to mix up these pages now. My
We-
close family and friends will attest to me being an antagonist, and I don't know if it's always with good reason or not. I hope so. So you mentioned Twitch specifically there, right? You're referring to their hateful conduct policy, which they updated in November 15 of 2024. Is that correct?
That's correct, yeah.
Can you give us a brief overview of that? What exactly did they do? What did they say? What was the update?
Yeah, absolutely. So in November 2024, Twitch basically updated their hateful conduct policy to also give stipulations about the conditions under which they would not allow users to criticize um, Zionism, or Zionists as individuals, right? And so, on its surface, it might sound relatively benign, but the issue is that when you make a policy like that, you're already kind of signaling that there is something inherently reprehensible about criticizing Zionism, which we should be able to criticize as as an ideology, as a political project that has resulted and continues to result in settler colonial devastation. But so basically, they said that they're updating their policy, to explain the terms under which they would disallow criticisms of Zionism on their platform.
Sorry,
And
wasn't it the use of the term as a
yes,
proxy?
so when they decide that you're using it in such a way that is clearly, speaking about Jewish people and kind of trying to conceal it, which again, anti-Semitism, is not a form of speech that we should be defending. But I think the danger is that when you create a policy like this, you're signaling that there is a situation that is so rampant that it needs to be policed. And you're also signaling that there is some kind of immediate association with, criticism of Zionism and with anti-Semitism.
I don't know if you're doing the latter. I'm not sure if you're doing the latter.
Yeah, what do you can you
Yeah,
elaborate?
yeah. Just repeat that. Just repeat those
Yeah.
last two sentences, please.
Well, I was just saying that the unveiling of a policy that states very
Mm.
clearly that they're going to disallow speech critical of Zionism, when they determine that it's used as a proxy, right? It suggests that there is something about anti-Zionism that is
That's
always kind of moving into the territory of anti-Semitism. I mean, it suggests that there's such a pronounced problem that a company needs to take it into, needs to sort of unveil new policies for policing and for disciplining speech, because this territory, the criticism of Zionism is always going to sort of get you into the territory of anti-Semitism. It indirectly, I would say, what I was trying to say, kind of also um, facilitates this notion that there's always kind of the danger of running afoul of anti-Semitism when you're critiquing Zionism. To say that you need to have a policy just to moderate particular forms of political expression, and that when you find them to run afoul in this way, it seems to suggest that there is something to this criticism that is inherently always going to be running into the direction of anti-Semitism.
I don't think it is, personally. I might be totally wrong.
No, no, tell me
But
what you feel.
well, the first sentence that you said there, and I can't. My brain's not sharp enough right now to quote it specifically, but it was they're banning the criticism of Zionism. Sorry, can you repeat that first sentence you mentioned? I feel like you've changed the phraseology.
Well, I think
You know,
I'll need to recall exactly, but I think it was basically the conditions under which they would disallow criticisms of Zionism, and then you filled it in like, as a proxy.
okay, this is how I read it. There are two issues that potentially arise, right? Or questions we can have. One is how prevalent is anti-Semitism that you feel you need to bring a policy, right now that specifically addresses anti-Semitism and so how much of an issue is this right now in this current moment, right? That's one of the questions. I think you kind of echoed there as well, right?
Well, how prevalent is it specifically in relation to the question of Palestine? I mean, that's the issue I was getting at.
They're not just talking about Palestine or context with regards to Palestine, are they? I mean, so the examples they give, so they give a prohibited example and an allowed example. And the prohibited example is Zionist close brackets name of an animal, right? Allowed example is Zionist settlers keep encroaching Palestinian borders. Okay, they have mentioned Palestine in that particular example actually. Okay, maybe I've missed something there. I'm not sure.
No,
I feel like it's reasonable to be honest with you, man.
no, no. I think it's reasonable to ban anti-Semitic speech. Absolutely. The point I was just trying to make, and we may just disagree on this, but my point is when you introduce an anti-Semitism policy that is specifically focused on Zionism, that seems to be more of a political move to monitor speech related to the subject that would entail criticisms of Zionism, such as Palestine. That's essentially the point I was trying to make. And that is the point that I advance in the chapter. We may agree or disagree on that, but just to be clear, like I'm not saying we shouldn't have policies about anti-Semitism because
No, I'm
we
not.
shouldn't have.
I'm not taking that from you at all.
Yeah,
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 yeah.
yeah.
It's just
But
the
I gotta
fact
say that
that.
also for the yeah,
Oh yeah,
yeah,
sure, yeah, yeah.
yeah, yeah,
But that's as a reader, that's not what I took from it either.
yeah.
It's just the fact that I do not find it surprising that people might use Zionist as a proxy to Jew or something like that.
Mm-mm.
I haven't personally come across it, but I don't. That's of no surprise. I mean, I'm sure it happens. How prevalent is it that you need to come up with update your hateful conduct policy? I have no idea.
That's the other point because when you do something, it is also a signal that there is a prevalence that necessitates some kind of intervention. That's the other point I was trying to make.
Are
You
you
know,
arguing there isn't then? Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that to me, this policy seems to suggest that there is kind of an association between political speech and anti-Semitism, political speech related to Palestine and anti-Semitism, because again, it's a conduct policy regarding Zionism itself. It's not regarding anti-Semitism as a whole, which I think we agree should be disallowed, right? But it's a policy that is saying that we need to more closely moderate how people use the term Zionism.
Is that in response to people using the specific term, as a proxy, though? In which case, it's not defending the term in and of itself. It's just stopping
My
this proxy usage.
but my sense is, and also based on some of the other moderation incidents that have happened at Twitch, um, my sense is that really it's in response to political expression rather than the proxy usage, or even honestly, it could be bad faith interpretations of the proxy usage, which is part of why some of these standards are also um, can be damaging because sometimes they can presume proxy usage when it is not there. Um, and something else that I had, what I mentioned too, is that this Twitch policy follows a few months after, Meta had
Meta.
also issued its own. Which again, if you go through any of these policies, you're going to find some things like I think we've done that it's like, okay, this sounds pretty straightforward. But then you may find other things that are a little bit less straightforward. So I believe in the Meta policy, I talk about this. There's something about rights to exist, which is okay, that's a little strange. This hews very closely to the notion of Israel having a right to exist. So is there conceivably a point at which somebody saying that I don't believe Israel has a right to exist, all of a sudden that's going to be hateful and removed from the platform? We don't totally know, but I think the ambiguity in and of itself is concerning, and some of the ways that this notion of this really being about rooting hate is enforced seems a little suspect to me. I think that's the broader point that I'm bringing up in the chapter and that I'm trying to get at in this discussion here.
Are they more strict and careful with their moderation policies with Israel and so on, as opposed to other communities and groups?
I
Is that
think,
part of the point?
yeah, that is part of the point because that's also, I mean, I do mention some other experiences of censorship that people have had, on the platform that also seems relatively inexplicable. Like I talk about, I believe some streamers who were doing a stream and talking about the boycott of Sabra Hummus, who I believe had also had a ban following that. Hassan Piker has had some bans. So it seems like the way that they introduce consequences is seemingly unbalanced and frankly opaque at times. So that is part of the point that I'm making. That's also part of the point that I'm talking about in the text as well, is ultimately a lot of these forms of moderation are kind of obfuscated. We don't know exactly when something is or is not going to be taken down despite the terms that were given, and it often hews more in the Palestinian side of things in terms of people having these challenges to their ability to use platforms. So again, that's part of what I was trying to do with the text.
This would tie into the intentional sort of bias in their moderation. Not just the
Yeah.
moderation, but even the updates and the statements. If you read through, there's more emphasis on moderating one side, let's say,
Yeah.
rather than the other.
Yeah, absolutely.
So in my questions here, Omar, I'm jumping between different platforms, right? But they generally work in a similar
Mhm.
manner, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So you gave an example in chapter 8 of your book by sorry, I'm not going to get his surname right, but Majd, Alrafie,
Oh
a
yeah. Yeah.
NSJP leader, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, Majd al-Rafi, yeah.
She mentioned since October 7th, 2023, we started to get many alerts on Instagram that posts could be taken down. And naturally, when these things happen, she mentioned, you panic and you question maybe I should dilute my politics online and so on. And perhaps this is an option. And essentially, what she said was this wasn't the way to go about things. It just meant that Palestinians and their allies needed to maneuver accordingly. And she specifically mentions here the use of, quote, algo speak, which is, you can tell us here, it's like coded language. Is it just throwing in numbers instead of letters and so on
Yeah, or emojis or
to get around these, say, I don't know, shadow banning or whatever the case may be. Is that
yeah,
right? Yeah.
that's right. Yeah, you want to avoid using terms that are more likely to trigger some kind of
Automated.
yeah, censorship. So like instead of, killed, you might say unalived, or you might use the skull, or you put numbers in words so that they're not traceable as the words that they actually are, really, so they're more likely to get by the censors. So yeah, exactly, it's just this code that you use for particular terms that are more likely to trigger the automated suppression, so that your post doesn't get the consequences that something that does trigger it normally would get, like as you're saying, shadow banning or such.
How sort of foolproof is that, especially with like the use of AI and so on? I'm sure these large corporations or companies will, use AI and such a lot more going forward. I feel like it won't be particularly hard for them to pick up on such coded language.
No, I don't. No, I don't think so. I mean, I think that the moderation is a constantly updating process, and the use of algo speak itself, I think, has become so frequent for us now. Like, I mean, I feel like I see posts using it all the time at this point. So it's clear that more people have, gotten the cue that this is what we need to do. So yeah, I expect censorship to just continue getting more and more refined. But I think once that happens, maybe we'll see different strategies being used, and we'll see how long those work. But kind of living with censorship was one of the main themes that the people I interviewed who are still active on social media spoke about. So things like algo speak, or sometimes I talked to somebody else, Laura Alborno, who was one of the Palestine pod co-creators, and she told me, well, sometimes I'll use a personal photo and just do something unrelated, because I know that if you post too much,
To offset it a bit,
yeah,
kind of, yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. She also mentioned here that, quote, this generation knows social media more than they do. They being the companies, Twitch, X, whoever. Can you expand on what exactly she meant by that? Because aren't Twitch, X, Meta, Instagram, whoever, aren't they employing this generation also?
hmm
I didn't quite understand that, because what I got from what she was saying is, as they update their policies and so on, and their algorithms and so on for picking up words, we are the next generation. We will adapt. We're kind of one step ahead.
yeah,
Is that what she was implying?
yeah,
However, our generation is also being employed by them. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure I quite understood that. I kind of feel like maybe I'm going on a bit here, but I kind of feel like social media is just not going to, if they want to shut it down long term, they probably will.
yeah, yeah. No,
Tell me I'm wrong. Yeah,
I see. No, I see what you're
that's what I meant
saying.
with the use of AI as well. Like it's like exponential, potentially the how quick they can get you. I guess as you adapt, you're
Yeah, well, I
fighting a
mean,
computer, man.
it's not. Well, it's not incidental too that many of the people I spoke to actually also really started advancing this idea of we either need to get off these platforms or make new ones ourselves. Which that was a problem that people kept returning to, and they had different opinions on. So like when I talked to Nardine Kaswani, for example, who you talked about earlier in the pager, um, quote had would say this a lot, like when you organize on these platforms, you're on private property, and they can shut you down at any point. We need to find alternatives. And
Mm.
then I also talked to people from Samidun who said, well, we use alternative platforms, but at the same time, the problem is so many people are still on the hegemonic platforms, and we need to meet people where they are. We can't just abandon. So it's not an easy question, but like there's definitely a broad-based consensus within the movement that these platforms in many ways are compromised and are getting more and more censorious. But to come back to the question about Mej's quote. I think in a literal sense, you're right. But I also took it a little bit more. Um, what's the word
Defiant
I'm
with it.
looking for? Defiant, yeah, but I think it's also a little bit, yeah, defiant, but also not quite symbolic. Like, yeah, I guess it's not super literal either. Like, I didn't necessarily take her to mean literally we understand it better as the youth, but I think it's something that goes back to a spirit that has animated a lot of what Palestinian resistance through media looks like in the book, which is this idea that we have these platforms that were created for particular purposes, right? Not just digital media. Like we can go all the way back to corporate legacy media platforms as well, right? They are basically designed with a particular function in mind, which is to advance the narratives that we want advanced and to leave everything else out. But time and time again, you've seen as Palestinians and their allies cleverly repurpose these mediums to make them do what they weren't supposed to do, right? To talk about Palestine in a way that wasn't supposed to be permitted on the space. And so I took it more so as we are going to keep being able to do that, right? Even though they're the literal owners, they literally have the material, power more so than we do. We're still going to continue to find ways to engage in these different forms of resistance and outpace them. Now, so I took it as this kind of spirit, you know, this spirit of
Right.
creative reappropriation that continues to animate activism and organizing for Palestine. On a very literal level, is that going to be true? We don't really know, but we have to keep acting as though it's true, right? That's the point.
Right.
Because if
Right.
you, so yeah, that's kind of how I read that quote.
Well, keep acting as if it's true, but the alternative is, as you mentioned, the potentially alternative platforms.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
what if they were based in China? What if it was
yeah.
a company based in China? Something like that. I mean, a
Well, we
lot, a
kind of
lot
saw
of.
that. We saw how some
Oh,
of
sorry,
that's.
TikTok. What an idiot. Yeah. Yeah, I didn't think that one through. Yeah. Um, well, it's just because much of what I've got from reading your book is that there's a real intertwining between imperial America, capitalism, and I guess what Israel represents, a colonial, almost, would you use the term outpost is often
Hmm.
used for America? And so I don't know, I was thinking if these like corporate entities or social media companies were based elsewhere where they don't necessarily just align with the American vision, I guess.
It's kind of funny that you mentioned that because actually coming to TikTok, I did have this conversation with an organizer who works for, I don't know if you know Hamle, the digital rights organization.
What was the name again, sorry?
Hamlet, but it's written like with the seven, like it's supposed to be the Arabic
Oh
letter,
yeah,
but
I have it down
yeah,
here. Yeah,
Hamlet,
yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Seven, yeah.
yeah.
AMLEH, yeah.
And I talked to an organizer who's done work for them, and he told me actually like having worked with TikTok because they have to track censorship across all platforms, so they even were talking about TikTok, and I think this would have been probably October 2024, perhaps. So it's a particular moment in time, but all of which is to say, like obviously we're getting into completely new ownership now, so it's like going to be different, right? But
Yeah, yeah.
at the time that he was saying, he's like, even though we do see that the censorship is increasing, I do think a large part of the fact that TikTok historically has been the slowest, if you look at the scale of other platforms to censor, was because a lot of the people working for that company really weren't brought up under this political climate where Islamophobia
Right.
and anti-Arab racism is so normalized. So it's like,
Yeah.
even if they're getting complaints, they're not even gonna like recognize in the same way that somebody who is right wing and is Zionist would see a complaint about somebody
Yeah,
saying
yeah.
free Palestine here. Like, yes, it is hate speech, right? It's like they didn't have that kind of broader cultural context, and
There's
so
an area of influence that doesn't affect them personally.
yeah. So
Yeah.
that's kind of how they were putting it. Now, of course, again, like the ownership has shifted, and the censorship itself even was increasing more. I think as the app and as ByteDance, continue to face more and more pressure. But certainly, he was saying there's something to that. That because it was a different political and cultural context, that wasn't hewing to the American kind of imperialist mindset or the Western imperialist mindset, we could say that did make a difference, and he felt that.
Yeah, you have to forgive me, Omar. We're past halfway, and I feel like I've just been negative throughout this. So I'm going to carry on a little
That's
bit, and
good.
then I'll try and maybe make some points that we agree on a
It's
bit more.
It's good. It's good. I no, it's nice to get different perspectives, honestly.
Well,
Not feel like I'm saying the same things over and over, you
yeah,
know?
I always find myself interested in things where I don't agree necessarily, or you know, I don't just like sitting and talking about something we already agree on, really, and I do find that to be quite common. That's kind of how I ended up sort of starting to try and, I don't know, reach out to people and see if they want to speak. So appreciate the opportunity. Okay, so in chapter 5 of your book, also similar to this censorship situation, you give a few examples of Instagram, they're owned by Meta, removing condolences posts. One example is that of Erdogan, Turkey's president. He put up a post on Instagram giving his sort of condolences to Ismail Haniyeh, who was assassinated in Tehran. Meta is US based, right? And
Yeah.
Hamas, which Ismail was the political head at the time, they are a proscribed group, right? Officially a terrorist group in the US specifically. Is it surprising they took it down? Is my question. And I think you pointed to this potentially being a free speech issue.
I mean, this is a specific context because it's the political leader of another country making a post. So I think it was like ultimately, yeah, I think that that's what made it so interesting of an example is, I mean, you know, you have the president basically making a post and having that post taken down, you know, under the
Yeah.
terms and conditions of that platform. And again, I mean, these are US based companies,
Mm.
right? But at the same time, they're also operating internationally, and people have, you know, different norms and customs internationally and politically speaking. So, like, I don't know, is it that strange? I mean, I could kind of see it going both ways because on the one hand, I can understand what you're saying that, you know, there's this prescription within our context and this is an American company. But on the other hand, you know, not, you know, there's also other political leaders in other contexts where, you know, this is not active or not active in the same way. And now, would you, if you ask me, like, is it surprising that posts about organizations, you know, like we could say Hamas or the PFLP, is it surprising that they get taken down?
Is it a free speech issue, or is it just the company following the prescription, you know, the law in the country that they operate out of? Do you know what?
Yeah,
Do you get my question? Like,
yeah,
which
yeah.
of the two is it? You as an American, is it illegal for you to post a condolence post for a member of Hamas on Instagram?
What's illegal is material support. You can have your political beliefs, right? But it's material support, like you're actively working with, you know, or for the organization or providing funds or, you know,
I think in the UK it's slightly different. Then
because
you
you have
can't.
the Palestine Action Law now, the ban as
Yeah,
well, right? Like,
yeah. Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's something like even sentiments. I'll put it on screen. It's sharing sentiments like in favor of them or in support of them. That's dissimilar to the US then. A post sharing your condolences to an individual who, under US law, is a terrorist. It's not breaking state law.
no, no, that's not. It's supposed to be really like material support. That's supposed to be what it is. Now, that doesn't mean that people haven't tried for years to blur the lines between political and material support, right? I mean, there's so many cases of people who've been tried, you know, um, unsuccessfully at most of the time, but you know, still tried because they had political advocacy that supported. Um, well, people tried to spin it out to be that they were supporting, you know, prescribed groups, you know, but that in and of itself, politically to believe that is not the same as to engage in material support. That's the distinction. But so the project for many who don't want any kind of political support for Palestine has always been to try to blur the distinction between political and ideological and material support, if that makes sense. So to say that any kind of advocacy is automatically like equated with support for a foreign, you know, terrorist organization as designated.
So officially, there's no issue with it, but the way they use this, there's an intentional blurring of the lines.
Yeah, yeah, I would say, and again, here we're talking about the broader political project. Yes, they try to blur the distinction between political and material support and advocacy. Um, so to come back to the question of now the platforms do have this policy. If it's a prescribed, you know, like don't allow posts about anything related to these organizations, right? That if it's a prescribed organization or an extremist group, but ultimately this is them deciding on that as a policy of moderation and enforcing it, right? It may
Is it
seem,
unreasonable? Is it unreasonable decision?
yeah, I think so, and I'll tell you why. I mean, there's also a lot of context in which you simply need to talk about organizations to get into questions of Palestinian politics or political
Mm,
history. Like you do need to talk about, the PFLP. You do need to talk
yeah.
about Hamas. Like, and so there's a lot of context in which you would need to engage in conversations about political organizations, right? But your ability to do so is always going to be challenged. And in fact, I've also talked to people who had experienced, the banning or the removal of posts, for things like, okay, there's an image of Leila Khaled or there's an image of Hassan
Yeah,
Kanafani,
I want to ask
in
you about
particular.
that
Yeah,
particular
yeah.
example.
Particularly like Hassan Kanafani. I mean, he's a writer too. Like, yes, he was,
Yeah.
he did have this role um, in, the PFLP. He was head of communications, as well. But ultimately, he was also a Palestinian writer. So there's a lot of reasons that we need to be able to talk about him. So yeah, I would say it. I can see how perhaps in a certain context it seems relatively straightforward, but I feel like there's also a lot of points at which it starts to break down too. Like it's not so simple as, okay, this is prescribed, so we can never have anything about it, because there's a lot of context in which you do need to talk about different resistance figures to talk about the politics.
On Leila Khalid, in chapter 10 of your book, you mentioned in April 2021, after removing an advertisement for an Arab and Muslim ethnicities and diasporas studies program event at San Francisco State University that featured Palestinian icon Leila Khalid, Facebook deleted the academic program's page. This deletion followed months of collaboration between San Francisco State University and private tech companies like Zoom to violate the academic freedom of AHMED studies program. The director, is it Rabab Abul Hadi?
Abdul Hadi, yeah.
Abdul Hadi, by preventing an event with Khalid from appearing on any digital platform. You mentioned here Instagram has admitted to limiting the visibility of content that it deems inappropriate, even when the posts in question do not run afoul of the platform's community guidelines. So, in this particular example, if I've missed anything there, Omar, please do fill us in. But they wanted to host Layla Khalid in a Zoom call, right, for their class. Is that correct?
Yeah, so the Arab and Muslim Ethnicities Diaspora Studies program at San Francisco State University. I also teach for that program. But so it was the director, Professor Rabab Abdul Hadi, and Timomi Kinokawa of Women and Gender Studies were co-hosting an open classroom.
She was a guest.
Yes.
So she was a member of the PFLP you mentioned earlier, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. I understand she's, I think, not very well at the moment, and I think she's in the 80s, right? I'm not sure if she's still a member, is my point, or not. I don't know if you know,
Well, the thing is,
because the group is prescribed. Was the
yeah,
point here? Yeah,
but this is what I was going to get to. Is
yeah,
part of the defense for the class. You had Palestine Legal, the civil rights organization,
right, yeah, yeah.
writing and protest, and part of what they said is, like this person basically is not being invited to speak in their capacity as a political figure. They're being asked to speak to the content of the class, and that was part of their saying that Zoom should not be able to move forward with blanket deletion of a class, or disallowing of a class to continue on its platform. I think this was, if I'm not mistaken, I think this could be the first time that it happened. I don't want to run with that 100%. There may be
Okay,
another incident I'm not sure of, but I feel like this was the first time that Zoom actually banned a class from occurring, and this was still, during the lockdown, I believe, as well, because originally September 2020, and then they tried to redo it later on in April, I believe.
2021.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and so yeah, yeah. So I mean, the platform certainly said, this is a prescribed group, so we're not going to allow this to happen. But the legal argument was, this is a person not being invited to speak as a representative of an organization. They're being invited to speak to the class about the contents of the class, gender justice and liberation. And
Okay.
so they should be allowed to. Then again, this is the legal argument for it that I'm
Yeah.
giving you.
Sure. Yeah.
Um,
I'm not at all.
no, no, I know, yeah, but
This
I'm
is
just
nothing
like,
to do with how I feel about it, by the way.
yeah,
I'm
yeah.
just trying to stick to, like, the laws and so on. Are people being honest? Is there an intentional, say a bias here? But anyway, sorry, continue.
Yeah, so that was part of the legal support for why the class should have been allowed to continue, and of course, it did, get banned. And Part of the context I should also give is, the ban came about also as a result of kind of this massive coordinated campaign by, there's this, I think it's now defunct, but there's this app called Act-IL, which is essentially um, an Israeli-aligned app that gets its users to engage in multiple different quests or causes. And so
Okay.
this app had a campaign, make sure that Zoom cancels the class, basically. So users were
Right.
getting
Okay.
prompted to do this en masse. You had protests in front of Zoom's office. And so eventually Zoom decided we're just not going to allow this to happen, right? But again, I think this was the first time that a class gets preemptively banned, from that company's platform.
This legal argument that you mentioned there, I don't quite understand it. I mean, for example, the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps in Iran, sort of one of their main military groups, they are designated as a terrorist group, aren't they, in the US? So if a
Mm-hmm.
member of that organization was, it was going to feature as a guest in your Zoom call at San Francisco State University, but not in their capacity as a, I don't know, a general in the IRGC, but as a rocket scientist or something.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not trying to be, I want to be careful the way I'm wording my question, but it seems like a strange argument. Am I making any sense? I wouldn't be surprised that they would say, hold on, no, you can't have a member of the IRGC by US law, right? Not giving my opinion or trying to guess yours or anything like that. By US law, they're a terrorist organization. You can't just say they're joining just to teach you about how rockets work. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I understand your position, but
It's
uh,
sorry, it's not. I just want to be clear. It's not
no, no, I
necessarily my
understand. I'm sorry, I
position.
understand what you're saying. That's what
It's
I
the
meant to say.
logic
I
I'm.
understand the
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
logic
I just want to
of.
be totally clear in what I'm
I
saying.
get no, I totally, yeah, I understand what you're saying. Um, but
So what's the
the
issue with it
this
if that is the case? Is my question?
no, no, I mean it's not the case. That's the point. That's why there was this legal defense of allowing the class to continue.
Mm.
And I think it should have been allowed to continue. Now I understand, like I see the perspective that you're laying out. I'm not going to say like I understand what you're saying. Like I see the perspective,
Yeah, yeah.
but the point is that in this moment there should have been support for the academic freedom of Professors Abdul Hadi and Kinokawa, um, because again, like I see the point, but the idea is that you're having a speaker to come to speak about a particular topic. We could talk about it, and it can seem relatively clear cut, but I think the point is that it wasn't necessarily right. That's why there was this legal arguments in defense of the class. Now, and there's again this idea to have a speaker come and talk about gender justice and liberation within the Palestinian context and in the context of global anti-colonial struggle. So the I do think that we have the possibility of a legal defense precisely, or of a legal argument at least in favor, precisely because it's not as clear cut as it might seem.
Is this specific to Palestinian groups, Palestinian repression? Is that part of the argument as well? That it's kind of
Well,
pro-Israel, anti-Palestine?
well, that's the thread that I follow, and that's what I write about. I mean, I think ultimately, perhaps you could find, other contexts in which there's other forms of targeting, but like in this case, I think that was one of the outsized questions. Yeah, I think it definitely is. In this case, I think it is the Palestinian question,
Okay.
no doubt.
Why? Why?
Well, I mean, the fact that it was a class with Leila Khaled, speaking in an open forum where, although there were students in the class, the class was supposed to be an open classroom, so, which meant that anybody from all over could basically have tuned in if they had wanted to. Um,
Mm.
and I think there was this sense that having a figure so entwined with Palestinian revolutionary history to come, and be provided such a large platform within a U.S. university context, there was something that people felt that they needed to stifle, right? That they couldn't allow it to go on. I mean, that's why I think it is the Palestinian context, because in this case, it's literally about, a Palestinian speaker, being asked to speak to a class.
Would they have acted the same if it was like Putin or something like this? I don't know, a different group is my point.
That's the trouble with hypotheticals, is you don't you don't know.
My kind of uncertainty here is I'm not sure, in my layman limited capacity here, in what I've read and heard, I'm not sure that this particular issue here can be pinpointed to specific to Palestinians without any counter examples of where they've allowed the opposite with someone else. So it's kind of an open question almost. It was, to me anyway, potentially. I wouldn't be surprised if it is, because it's a Palestinian issue. Yeah, I'm not sure if it's a case of everyone falling in line with the US policy because they're in the US, or if it's specifically anti-Palestinian. If there was an example of, okay, someone, they tried to have, I mean, I guess the Iranian example is kind of similar, so maybe that's not a good one, but I don't know. Yeah, Russia or someone, I don't know, someone from their military was going to join a call for some kind of rocket engineering conversation, not as a member of their army. And that was allowed. Okay, fair enough, academic freedom and whatnot. Then I can see the argument. Hold on, you didn't care about the proscription of a group in this case, in the Russian case. You allowed it because of academic freedom. You found that acceptable. So why are you stopping Leila Khaled or someone from the PFLP? It's clearly, more than likely, the inference I would take is it's because they're Palestinian. Obviously, it's a pro-Israeli bias. But without that counter example, I'm not sure of how certain you can be of that. I don't know. I don't know if that makes sense.
I think I see, I follow what's being laid out. This was, in many ways, I think, and goes back to my point of, well, I don't know if I could say 100%, but I think that this was really a unique case on many levels. Um, you know, but again, I think the fact that this was happening in a university classroom, and this is the other thing that sometimes gets left out of the story. Like, it wasn't just Leila Khaled; it's Leila Khaled in conversation with other revolutionary figures from different contexts, including the South African struggle, who are all coming to speak together in kind of this broader sort of roundtable format. And so a lot of times it'll get exceptionalized to just talking about Leila Khaled and just to the particulars that sort of justified the ban. But in reality, this was going to be a broader conversation about collective liberation that included revolutionary figures from many different struggles, including Khaled, who is a renowned symbol and figure of Palestinian resistance. And ultimately, there was this massive counter campaign, to get the class shut down that was successful, and that Zoom capitulated to. Not once, but twice, right? Because after it had happened, then there became this sense of we can't let this happen again, even though other figures at other institutions, tried to use their resources to help them get access. The same thing sort of had repeated itself. So I think I understand this notion that, well, if we don't have a counterexample, we can't be sure. But we could also look at, the suppression that Dr. Abdul Hadi has continued to face. We could look at the ways that a lot of these platforms in general are over censoring in relation to Palestine. And, we could say that it
There's a
seems pretty
correlation.
likely. Yeah, exactly. We can see the forms that censorship and repression have taken in the past, and we can also think about the fact that there's something about this conversation in particular that people didn't want to allow to happen.
So in chapter 6 of your book, regarding Musk's acquisition of X and also SpaceX specifically, and then Starlink, which operates under SpaceX, I believe, right? So you mentioned Musk, and people are probably well aware, but he had this massive posturing, as you put it, of, I don't know, I feel like it's kind of fear-mongering a bit, but people have their own understanding of this free speech concern, right? And then at some point, he reposted something, and his comment was, "You have spoken the truth," or something. It was something kind of anti-Semitic about, people don't talk about the Jews, and something about replacement. I'll put it on screen for people. And so he had a clash then with the ADL, right? If people are watching
Right.
this far, they're probably used to my going all over the place. So I'm relying on you to make this all coherent, Omar. Yeah. So he buys X with this whole concern of free speech. At some point, he reposts some kind of anti-Semitic trope. So I don't know. Is he an anti-Semite? People are saying he's like a neo-Nazi. I mean, people remember his kind of salute or Roman salute or whatnot as well. But at the same time, he's talked about banning the statement "from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." My question here is, Omar, and fill in the gaps for me where I've missed them. Where is the balance between claims that Elon Musk is a neo-Nazi who, since acquiring X, has unbanned known neo-Nazi accounts, and it's become a cesspit of fascist neo-Nazi stuff? How is that balanced with the anti-Palestinian side of things as well?
The way I see it is that Musk is a very far-right individual who's co-signed all of these reprehensible views, including the one you were talking about, right? You've spoken the truth that, but so, and then following, ultimately, what I think is going on is that part of his um, more direct political embrace of Zionism and collaboration with Israel to a certain extent is also um, an attempt for him to kind of evade, I would say, um, accountability for
It's a
his.
mirage.
Yeah, it's a mirage or a smokescreen to
Okay.
really sort of allow him sort of a way to get out of accountability for his actual boosting of various forms of anti-Semitism. I think there's this sense that if I'm politically working with the Israeli state, if I'm um, buddy buddy with Netanyahu, if I'm doing all these things, then somehow it's kind of an escape from accountability for the actual anti-Semitic things he's done. And of course, Netanyahu has said that has also praised Musk basically in his use of
Recently,
Twitter
indeed,
at
yeah.
some points,
He's a friend or
So,
something like that, he said, yeah.
yeah, I mean, and I think that to me also just reveals kind of some of the broader danger of Zionism, in that really it constantly needs to engage in this process of redefining anti-Semitism simply to mean support for Palestine, to the extent that actual anti-Semitism can be allowed sort of swept under the rug. Um, you know, when you have like various far right figures, we have Musk, you can think about somebody like Bannon, Steve Bannon, the US, all these things that can have great, support for Israel and great relationships with the Israeli project, right? And that is seen as somehow enough, to the point where the actual views are not an issue. I think it kind of shows you how cynical some of this is. But yeah, so that's how those things coexist for me.
Do you know, did he actually ban that statement?
He said he was going to. I mean, my sense is that he said he was going to, and I certainly know of individual accounts of having, like trouble with Palestine related posts on X, but I don't really think he could ban it en masse if we literally take it to mean like anything that ever says that gets removed. I think it's
Right.
more so that some people are facing um, targeted moderation when their accounts come under some kind of scrutiny,
Yeah.
and that's the spirit with which he intends to go about moderation. But just physically, in terms of sheer scale, I don't think he was able to do that. But certainly, people are having posts removed, people are being shadow banned, people are experiencing more difficulty on it. I think he would want to physically do it. I don't think he literally has the ability in terms of scale, but they certainly have been restricting the reach of Palestine content. And I know of many accounts that have been removed or people who've migrated elsewhere.
Just to summarize, correct me if this is right or wrong, or a relationship between someone like Musk and Netanyahu is a relationship of almost like a mutual enemy.
Yeah,
Yeah.
expedience and convenience, and I mean, of course, there's like other incentives, I guess, too. Like the entrenchment of Israel in the tech industry, and Musk
Mm.
wanting to, obviously playing a role in that. So there's reasons why they would be gravitating towards one another. But I would say that definitely this performance of the embrace of Israel, a large part of it is to sort of evade accountability for his actual anti-Semitic beliefs. Yes.
There's so much more I wanted to cover, but I know you have to go. I wanted to finish off on a final point if you got a couple of minutes.
Yeah.
So it's a quote from your book in chapter 10. But what it's kind of it hit my heart, to be honest with you. Yeah, my YouTube channel is very small, right? For anyone who's still listening, it only kind of picked up when I reached out to Professor Norman Finkelstein, and he, kind of gave me an opportunity and so on. And the interview went quite well. And I've kind of built whatever this small thing is, relatively speaking. It's been built since then. And the kind of disgusting thing about it is, it's kind of built on it's built in tandem, I guess, with the genocide in Gaza. You know,
Hmm.
it's almost like I could be benefiting from it in a sense. The way I try and rationalize or trying to mitigate any risk of that is I could probably post a lot more and do these sort of dumb debates from a place of ignorance and get more views and stuff by putting Palestine, Israel stuff in there. And I refrain from doing that, and I try and, you know, have conversations and try and, I guess, learn and stuff, as opposed to maximize
Yeah,
views. You
yeah,
know, you've had this beautiful book over here, Omar. I'll drop a link below for where you can purchase a copy of that, hopefully. Have you had a similar thought at all like this? You have a book coming out that
absolutely.
you won't have sold as many as you are hopefully going to sell if it wasn't for the current situation. Do you know what I mean? It sounds
Yeah, yeah.
disgusting, man, but it's kind of true. And I'm not sure how the best way to rationalize that or internalize it or understand it, you know?
I have a feeling I know which quote you're talking about from there, Dean. That's the one about the. So, yeah, I thought about this a lot actually, and in a funny way, uh, part of the reason that I wanted to include that quote in the book was precisely because I know so many people are struggling with that. You know, the sense that on the one hand, you're talking about horrible things happening to Palestinians, but that because there is such a wave of interest on a certain level, it becomes a potential means for people also to get more clout ultimately, right? And it is really horrible, you know, to think about it on those terms. But so I've thought about it a lot, and again, the reason I wanted to put it in the book was precisely because for Nardine to say that, it really showed me that this is a bigger issue that so many people who are in the movement and who do the work are living with. So I think it's important to acknowledge it precisely because, you know, all of us are struggling with that and trying to make sure that the work that we're doing is beneficial and isn't just, you know, about boosting ourselves or boosting our brands or selling something, right? And really making sure we're not engaging in it. um, I don't think I think if we are good people, we have to make our peace with the fact that we're never going to totally be comfortable with that possibility, and that the best we can do is just know that we are trying as much as possible to make sure that what we're putting out there is being done for the broader purpose of supporting Palestine, opposing the genocide, and ultimately supporting the broader cause of Palestinian freedom. And we need to continually be scrupulous with ourselves in making sure that those are our guiding motivations, right? But I think there's
Yeah.
going to be moments of doubt, and we really can't escape it. But we need, as difficult as it can feel, we need to be aware of those possibilities, right? And we actually need to embrace the discomfort that comes with it to make sure that we're continuing to hold ourselves accountable.
In a practical sense, it's pausing every so often and double checking kind of what your intention is here. Why am I making this video? Why am I making this statement?
Yeah, and why I'm not doing certain things. You know, like you're saying, I could do a lot more. I could do X, Y, Z. You know, I live with that too. I'm like, you know, I don't need to post about my book right now or do this right now. Like, let's just support a fundraiser or let's do this. You know, like there's the ways that we check ourselves too can be very important. I don't think we want to get to a position where we don't engage at all, because that's also not necessarily advancing anything. But we really just need to exactly continue checking in with ourselves. You know, what is my ultimate motivation here? Is this about boosting me, boosting myself or my brand, or am I trying to actually do something that makes a bigger difference?
Yeah, I already had that kind of, I don't know, cognitive dissonance or something going on in the back of my head. And so when I read that quote, I thought, damn it, yeah, someone else is thinking that as well,
Yeah.
man. So many accounts have blown up with this Palestine, Israel versus, you know, in the title, and you get a lot of views. Any final comments, Omar? I'll drop any links for the purchase of your book, your socials, and so on. Any final comments? I know I'm over time here.
I,
Say
I just
anything.
want to say, like, you know, one thing I've been realizing is writing the book made me a lot more pessimistic about platforms, but a lot more optimistic about people. You know, I learned in the process that it's really not platforms, it's always people engaging in creative new forms of resistance that has always made the difference. And I think that's what's going to make the difference for the Palestinian struggle too. So even if, as you were saying, the platforms just get completely nuked and that's it, we lose it, because that's totally possible. Like, Palestinian resistance is not going to stop by any means, and that's what's going to secure, freedom and liberation for the Palestinian people.
Yeah. Yeah, to quote your book, the story of Palestine is a series of veiled silencings. So long may that continue. Thank you.
Inshallah. Thank you.
Inshallah.